Imagine majestic sloping hills with jagged rocks jutting out of them, all overlooking a picturesque lake that stretches beyond the horizon. The water glitters peacefully in the sunlight, begging for you to dip a toe or take a swim on a hot day. But you've never been in that water. You don't want to get schistosomiasis, a parasite that lives in the lake and breaks down the liver. You walk up a hill along a dirt road with potholes so massive you wonder how cars could possibly drive down it. Boys run down the street playing with cars they made from old soda bottles, and a 4-year-old girl shuffles by carrying her baby brother on her back. Here we are far away from the world of Newark, Delaware, but in the city of Mwanza, Tanzania, people are happy and living their lives the way they only know life to be. This was my home for the last year, Mwanza, Tanzania. Tanzania is a country in East Africa, just south of the big pointy bit that juts out the right side of the continent. I spent a year here teaching and performing medical research, and formed many friendships with the local medical students and researchers. As we got to know each other, I asked about their perceptions of America. They would often talk about the superiority of the Western world, and especially the United States. It comes there from all angles: music, pop culture, Facebook, movies, even all the way to Tanzania. Wow, America is so wonderful, they would say. And I would explain that while the Western countries do have a plethora of wealth and resources, we have our problems too. For example, I would say in many of our cities, there's been an increase in the homeless population. But why? One woman asked me. Thinking it was a translation issue, I described what the word homelessness meant. No, my friend asked. Why would you let them sleep on the street? Don't you have room in your house? Oof, and there's the disconnect right there. The idea that we would let members of our community suffer great hardships while we have an easy way to help is not conceivable. In Tanzania, people often have very little, but they give very much. They have an idea of collective self, which differs greatly from our individualism back in the West. There's a word for this shared belief of self. It's called Ubuntu. This is a Bantu word derived from the languages of Southern Africa. While I often heard the word Ubuntu used in Southern and not Eastern Africa, I think it's a good symbol of this same belief, that of community and belonging, of this interconnectedness of people in a shared culture. It goes beyond helping your neighbor. It means that you do not see yourself as separate from your neighbor, but as all part of the same larger family, where everyone is your brother and everyone is your sister. I've had the amazing fortune to visit countries on every continent of our world and interact with local people. I've seen Westernization take hold over traditional societies and the effect that it can have. Westernization can bring some great things. It often comes with the influx of new wealth into a country, maybe from a large business that's invested in a natural resource, or through the emergence of thriving tourism infrastructure. But this money also comes wealth disparity. Those who are able to adapt to this new environment, perhaps because they speak the language of the new business, can thrive, whereas those who continue to live more traditional lives often get left behind. This brings me to the idea of wealth disparity. As you can see on the map, Tanzania has one of the lowest wealth disparity indexes in the world. Most people here live around the international poverty level, or less than $2 per person per day. Think of that. Less than $2 for your food, clothing, education and housing, electricity and transportation. But in a society where your neighbors have the same as you do, that can be all right. When everyone lives together like this, they use each other and their community as their support system to raise their children, fix their roads together after a flood. People share what they have and they trust their neighbors and their community. Now let's look at a really different place that I lived, Cape Town, South Africa. This one's pretty easy to find on the map. It's right at the southernmost tip of Africa. I lived in Cape Town for a year before moving to Tanzania, and although they're on the same continent, they're worlds apart. In fact, South Africa has one of the highest wealth disparities in the world. Although apartheid, the legal separation based off of race, officially ended in South Africa in the 1990s, the remnants from this period and the country's colonial past still play a large role today. Imagine a nice, comfortably sized house with unlimited Wi-Fi, grand windows, and a large backyard to play in. Except now add to that yard tall walls, higher than you can reach, with electric wires and broken glass lining the top. This is where I lived in Cape Town. And across the street from your house is a nice playground with tall, big trees. And in those trees were men who made those gnarled branches their home, keeping everything they had there with them. At the end of the day, I learned to expect a ring at the doorbell to be one of these men asking if I had any leftover food. There are so many genuine people working hard to repair the scars of apartheid. But these extreme wealth disparities are still apparent in modern-day South Africa. I believe that these disparities can lead any group of people to start thinking of the group that they are not in as the other. In many societies with significant wealth divisions, people are brought up to assume that this is how the world works. Some people are the haves who've worked hard to get where they are, and others are the have-nots who should stop being lazy and sleeping in trees. The society that we grow up in has a major influence on us and where we see our place in the world. In my experience, when everyone around you is living a similar lifestyle, you start to see yourself as part of a larger whole. But in societies with the haves and the have-nots, individualism can start to take over. I want to be clear that I'm not advocating here for either extreme. While Ubuntu itself might sound like an ideal to live up to, in my experience, thinking of oneself as part of a larger whole often leads to a deficit of critical thought. And through my travels, I've seen how collectiveness and the lack of competition can lead people to not question what they're told. But there has to be some balance here. So what does this mean for those of us living back in the Western world? As you can see in this diagram, the societies of Western Europe have maintained relatively stagnant wealth divides over the last 40 years. The blue line at the top represents the income owned by the bottom 50% of the population, whereas the red line represents the income owned by the top 1%. Although Western Europe still has a definite wealth gap, in recent history, these differences have been about static. However, this is not true of the US, where the wealth gap is growing larger. This is obvious in the income now owned by the wealthiest in society compared to the bottom 50%. The US now has one of the highest wealth disparity indexes of any developed country. And not surprisingly, our society is at a precipice. As our political and racial tensions grow ever higher, our ways of thinking start to divide further. As wealth disparity increases in America, communities begin to fracture, and our ways of thinking become more individualistic. People feel like they have to stand up for themselves, or they're going to get left behind. Because when America's economy does boom, the wealth spreads less and less. I'm afraid of completely losing our shared belief for liberty and justice for all, our melting pot of diverse cultures living in harmony. As we fracture into multiple societies, we start to look more and more like two different countries sharing the same continent. I don't think I know the answer here, but I hope that we can start to think about where we are now, how we got here, and where we want our society to go in the future. America has a decision to make. Should we continue towards individualism or steer towards a collective society? Each of us needs to reflect on what balance we think is right, our own ideal level of Ubuntu.